Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And one of the best writers that the genre of science fiction has ever seen is Ursula K. Le Guin. And if you haven't already read or heard of Ursula K. Le Guin, you really need to learn more, read more by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of the best places you can start to really get a sense of some of the best work she's done is a story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. This is a story that I like to teach in my classes frequently. It's a very complicated story. In some ways, it's hard to teach because it's very complex, but, I've been thinking about the story a lot. I want to share with you my analysis of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So if you haven't already read it, I do recommend you go find it and read it. It's just a short story. I'm going to walk through that story. In many ways, me talking about the story is going to take longer than it would take you to read the story. It's not that long a story. It's well worth reading. You can Google, find it real easy. It's a very popular story that gets taught a lot. You can quickly find it on Google, even though you shouldn't be able to. You can. Go check it out. Read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. Come back here and listen to this analysis, and we'll walk through kind of how that story works and some of the sort of brilliant aspects of it, which I think are really useful to anyone who's interested in literature or just interested in writing. And while you're out there Googling Le Guin, go to strangeinc.ca and sign up for my newsletter. Strange Inc. is how I keep in touch. It's how I get away from the Zuckerbergs and the Musks and all these people who want to own my social media eyes. I'm not interested in that kind of thing. And I just want to talk to you. So strangeinc.ca is how we can do it. I'm going to send you what I'm up to. I'm going to send you draft work, new poems or stories or whatever. I'll give you a little glimpse before anyone else gets to see them. I'll give you some writing tips. I'll talk about some recommendations. What are great stories like Ursula K. Le Guin's stories and so on. And also, it's just my email to your email. You can reply right to it and get me. It's a nice way to for me to hear from you also about what you kind of care about, what you think I should analyze or look at more. What recommendations do you have for me? So please go to strangeinc.ca and sign up for the Strange Inc. newsletter. And now, without further ado, let's talk about Ursula K. Le Guin. Let's talk about the Ursula K. Le Guin story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Now, there's a number of things to talk about with this story. It's a very complicated and complex story with many, questions. But I want to start with just focusing on a really simple quality of the story, which is the fact that it is a fantasy. What do I mean by that? Well, there are effectively two massive divisions in literary fiction between realism and fantasy fiction. Now, we might just more broadly say realism and non-realism. In other words, there are stories that are broadly speaking meant to be mimetic. And that's a kind of fancy word that just means it's meant to imitate or represent the world around us. So in other words, there is a class of stories, a group of stories, which attempts what we call some form of realism. It tries to represent in the fiction what the world is like or was like. So in historical realism, perhaps, a historical fiction that has a realist tone, you would, for example, you maybe be reading a story set in the 1700s, and it's trying to get across to you what it was like to live in the 1700s. It would be based on research. It would, contain maybe reference to historical events, and so on and so forth. Possibly it's just a story set in the modern day, in whatever time you're reading it, more or less is when the story is set.
Again, it maybe is attempting to describe the world as it is, more or less, describe people as they are, more or less, and so on and so forth. People who do things that normal people do, people who maybe is trying to imagine an abnormal or unusual situation, something that doesn't happen to everybody every day, like, you're going to get attacked by a serial killer. But nevertheless, there is a world where there are serial killers. People get attacked by them. Maybe the story is trying to imagine what somebody would actually do in the scenario where that is happening. If you're reading that kind of a story, we're reading a story that's more or less in the world of realism, this mimetic. Mimetic simply is, means this trying to imitate the world. The fiction attempts to imitate the world. So, people aren't flying by flapping their arms and so on. However, there is a whole other group of stories, which, we don't have a really good name for. I like to just use the term fantasy. But technically, of course, we also have a genre of fantasy where there's like swords and dragons. But more broadly speaking, that's a genre we might call high fantasy. But more broadly speaking, a fantasy story is just any story that doesn't have, just has some element that is not realistic. It's not realistic. People are made out of cheese, and they talk when they talk. Instead, you can see the words falling out of their mouths. Their words are made out of like metal letters, and they fall to the ground and shatter. So that's a world that is not like our world, right? It's a fantasy world. There's a strange, unreal scenario, which is fundamentally unusual. Isn't the world that we know, isn't the world that we walk around in. The story is not trying to convince you of the reality of this cheese metal world. It's just a story that has a fantasy element in it. Now, the Omelas story is like this. Guin is not trying to convince you that there is or ever was a place called Omelas. She's imagining a place called Omelas, then telling you a story about it. Right? We could, maybe imagine some aspects of this world as being realistic. We could perhaps imagine, she actually makes a point of trying to convince you that she flat out says, actually, the narrator does, that the only thing that is convincing and believable in this entire story, the thing that registers as realistic amidst the fantasy, is the idea that people might torment and torture a child. So you might think that would be a strange claim to make, but that's the claim that's kind of being made here. She's saying this is a fantasy world that is obviously fantasy in the sense that we can never believe in its reality. The only thing that can maybe make us start believing in its reality is that this horrible thing is happening. And we can believe that people would do a horrible thing like this. And we can imagine it happening, and so on and so forth. Now, despite that claim inside the story, it's clear that this is not really based on anything in a sort of literal sense. But we're living in a fantasy world. We're talking about a fantasy scenario. There's not a place called Omelas. There never was a place called Omelas, and so on and so forth. Right now, the question becomes, when you're looking at any fantasy story, so just stepping off of Omelas for a second, anytime we're looking at any fantasy story, where the goal is not to represent the world as it is or as it was, but the story is adding some element of fantasy. It's making believe, make believe some aspect of the world. It could be extreme. It could be light. It could be, a world where, dragons, again, dragons are flying through the air. People ride them. People keep them as pets. It could be a world where, every time it rains, the ground becomes Laffy Taffy. It doesn't, any sort of non-realist aspect. More normally, of course, you get things like in Omelas. Here's a sort of dystopian scenario where there's a sort of nightmare aspect to an otherwise perfect world. The question just becomes, whenever you're looking at any fantasy with any sort of level, whether it's science fiction, horror, with a supernatural monster, or anything else, one thing to kind of think about is two questions to ask yourself when you're looking at a fantasy story. And this is also true, by the way, of social fantasies. So what I'm about to say here is kind of based on a psychoanalytic structure or framework, way to look at literature, and to some degree, social fantasy, social phenomenon. Psychoanalytic theory, which was originally developed by Sigmund Freud, and then later developed by figures like Jacques Lacan and Slavoj Žižek. This is discredited as psychological science. No psychologist worth anything would believe or continue to follow psychoanalytic theory. But what we've discovered is that psychoanalytic theory is useful, not in psychology so much as when looking at some large social trends, but more specifically looking at literature. Psychoanalytic theory works very well when looking at literature, in part because literary movements were so heavily influenced by Freud. But also we can see certain structures at play in our social realm, because how we fundamentally, psychoanalytic theory is a good way to read stories. And what we do in the social world is tell one another stories and tell groups to form their own identity, start to sort of tell one another stories or get caught up in a fiction. The modern form of the fantasy that is most familiar to people is the conspiracy theory, where we have this story that has been this total fiction, this fabrication that people wholeheartedly believe. They don't see it as fiction; they see it as nonfiction. They see it as the truth. Now, when we're looking at fiction, we're looking at literature. It's very easy to understand what's fiction, what's nonfiction. If there's a dragon flying through the sky, it's fiction. But once you move into the social realm, you'll find that some of these weird fictional stories that are as bizarre as that in many respects, will just sort of accrue a level of groupthink belief, and individuals start sort of to get caught up in the fiction. They'll get caught up in the fantasy of the conspiracy theory. Fundamentally, what is happening is the same thing. Same thing when we're reading a fiction or getting caught up in a sort of everyday fiction. But it's harder to see one, easier to see the other. In both cases, though, the thing to consider is two questions. Anytime you're looking at a fantasy, you want to think about two different questions. One is simply, how does this fantasy fulfill some need? And another way of phrasing that is, why might we want it to be true? So, why might we want it to be true? In other words, how does it fulfill some need? What desire does it seem to fulfill? Le Guin, for example, is painting a picture of a perfect society, but one which is predicated on this fundamental injustice, this fundamental torment, this horror, this terror, this terrible thing. And she's imagining that in this world, some people choose to walk away. So what is the fantasy? How does it fulfill some need? Well, there's different ways to look at it, but one way to look at it, interpret this, is that Le Guin seems to be suggesting that some people will refuse happiness on principle, which might satisfy a desire to see humanity as principled, when in fact, it may or may not be. So the fantasy that some people would walk away from, Omelas, is arguably a fantasy that there's a certain amount of humanity, there's a certain, at its core basis, people are principled. The story, in fact, if you look at the Omelas story, it's written in such a way that it seems to suggest that there used to be a place called Omelas, and it no longer exists. It used to exist. Potentially it no longer exists because eventually everybody walked away. So that's one way to kind of look at it. If you're looking at the modern day form of social fictions, you're looking at social fiction rather than a literal, fictional story. Social fiction, like in conspiracy theory, for example. Again, the thing to ask is always the same thing. How is it that you might want it to be true? If somebody really, really believes that there's some fundamental, conspiracy afoot, and even if they are in terror of it, even if they state that they are afraid that this is the case, the reality often, almost always, is that in fact they would actually prefer the conspiracy to be true, because the conspiracy, as terrible as it might seem to them, as distressing as they might find it, the conspiracy satisfies a deep need that they have, which is the need to feel like there is someone in control, someone in power, someone in charge. They would rather usually feel like there are horrible, nightmare, satanic, evil forces in charge than feel that nobody is in charge, that it is a sort of chaos. The evil order is still an order, and order for some people is better than chaos. They just, would rather, somebody is pulling all the strings, then face the, sad truth that, the people pulling the strings, one, are just, too disconnected and too disorganized, and often just too stupid to enact a global conspiracy. It's a much sadder, smaller world in many respects. So that's one question. When we're looking at a fiction, how does this fantasy fulfill some need? Omelas, in what way is it maybe fulfilling the need of, the Guin or the reader in writing it? Possibly, again, there are just different ways to interpret it, but one reading of this story is that there's maybe a fundamental optimism here in the story. As horrible as it maybe seems, the situation that she's laying out for us, maybe fundamentally she has an optimism that eventually people will walk away from Omelas. Eventually, everyone will walk away, in short spans, perhaps. These kinds of things will be allowed to continue, but over the longer span of time, perhaps, humanity and justice will win out. Now, maybe Le Guin doesn't possibly believe that. Maybe she has, a completely different point of view. But that is one way to kind of look at the story, and it's one way to suggest its popularity. So that's one. I mean, it's not always the case that you're going to be able to pinpoint precisely what the need is, but this is just one option. Now, another thing that is worth asking always when we're looking at a fantasy, especially in fiction, is just how is the fantasy world exactly like our world? Even though it doesn't seem like our world because it has this unreal fantasy element, how is it actually exactly like our world? If you just ignore the fantasy element for a second, or if you kind of just put it to the side, what is the situation that we're looking at in the story? When you're figuring that out, what you're figuring out is there a metaphor here? Is there a symbolic level at which the story is working? So, for example, we've got this scenario in the story of Omelas where we have this utopian society. So we're just looking at one city, right? One place, one land. And in that land, in Omelas, there is, this beautiful, perfect society where everything is wonderful and everyone enjoys themselves. But they do still know. And in fact, their enjoyment in a weird way depends on them knowing this. they understand that in some way this is all predicated on the abuse of this innocent child. They know it, but either they get through their days, knowing it, somehow ignoring it. In fact, they maybe work harder to enjoy what they have, knowing that there's somebody paying this price. So how does this work? It makes sense as a metaphor for our own world. Well, there's different ways to read it, but one way to look at the Omelas story, of course, is to see it as an allegory or a metaphor for how the first world's prosperity depends on the historical oppression and exploitation and the continual, present day exploitation of, the third world or of other cultures. So the enjoyment, for example, of cheap goods because of child labor in other countries is the clearest example. You can afford a shirt at Superstore because it was made in a sweatshop in Indonesia. That's the cleanest example of the Omelas situation at work in our everyday world. There are more complex examples, right? Like your iPhone and where it is in the kind of strip mining that produces the metals required to put the iPhone together, or this laptop I'm talking into right now, as a matter of course, and so on and so forth. We can just look closer to home. We're sitting here in Winnipeg, northern Manitoba here, has suffered great ecological devastation, and the Aboriginal populations in various northern areas have suffered greatly in order for southern Manitoba to enjoy inexpensive hydro, and of course the imbalances in water and water access is something that's a big issue in Canada. Ironically, often water will literally be kind of taken from one location and moved to another location, and you kind of devastate the drinking water in one area to provide it to another area. These are the sorts of imbalances and exploitations and kind of injustices that is fundamentally, Omelas is not meant to represent any one of them necessarily, but kind of that's fantasy structure operates as a nice metaphor structure for any number of things in this way. The kind of first world feeding sort of off the abuses of the other more oppressed populations in other areas. There's just this way in which that kind of imbalance is something that you see structurally in Omelas, and you can see it structurally in more complicated forms in the kind of real world. So it isn't a fantasy, it isn't a one-to-one connection where like this represents that, but you have this sort of this structure that we can see standing in for the structure elsewhere. The fantasy, in other words, sort of matches a reality on a symbolic, metaphorical level. Now, the strength of the fantasy story, is that it allows an author like Guin to write about these kinds of situations in such a way that it transcends the actual situation. So it doesn't have as much political use. If I were to actually write a story about the actual, imbalance of power and the actual exploitation of, some particular population for some particular purpose, there's a way that, then my story might draw attention to that particular abuse that's actually happening, and therefore, maybe can redress it or, set the stage for, redressing that situation. Some works of literature do that. The most famous example being Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is one of the literary texts that actually played an integral part in setting the stage for the American Civil War. But those texts that are more really directly and specifically about particular political situations tend not to age well. No one reads Uncle Tom's Cabin today unless they're studying it in a history class or something, because it is just not a story that holds up. We just don't. It's just not a story that works anymore. Whereas Omelas, something like Omelas, it addresses a lot of the same issues, but in a more vague, metaphorical level, and therefore it has more lasting power when it stops referring to, when the actual situation that the story seems to refer to goes away or changes to a great degree. Then, the fantasy story can just switch to refer to something else. If it just is presenting a structure, a fantasy structure, then different things can fill in the gaps. Different things can, the child can symbolize different things over time if it's, not clear what precisely it's meant to symbolize in the first place. Fundamentally, we've got a structure here where the child of Omelas is a scapegoat. He's a scapegoat figure. This answers a question of why the people of Omelas have to know about the child and his suffering. There's this, it's claimed in the story that their enjoyment, their happiness relies on them knowing that this child suffers. They can't just be happy without knowing the child suffers. They can't remain ignorant. They have to be told, they have to know. That is the precondition for their happiness. Well, why is this? There's a couple reasons for it from a structural point of view. There's no logic to it in pure terms, but from a structural point of view, there's a symbolic, kind of metaphorical logic to it. Because the child is a scapegoat. So the scapegoat is a symbolic figure who suffers for the sins of a community. It's blamed for its ills. It's sacrificed fundamentally. It takes on all of the suffering that otherwise would be spread across, other people. So it's effectively a human sacrifice that's happening here in Omelas. This child has been sacrificed. This human sacrifice here. They're not murdering the child, but they're tormenting the child instead. In life. But it's the fundamental same structure, with a structure of kind of human sacrifice. The community. Why is the scapegoat necessary and important? Of course, in reality, it's not possible for one person to take on the symbolic sins. You can't just be a sin eater, eating the sins of other people. We're working in a weird abstract spiritual realm that we're like, now it's a belief system that's just been fabricated, as opposed to something that's coming out of some real reality. But again, on the social level, the fantasy here in Omelas is that if this child suffers, Omelas will prosper. That's the social fantasy that they've all bought into. That's the conspiracy theory that they all believe, right? It's their ideology. It's the sort of belief that they take as natural and normal, when in fact is anything but. How does this work? Again, on a structural level, the way that societies tend to work, a community gets united around an identity. The identity gets constructed or grounded in a set of beliefs, an ideology, a set of beliefs about what is and isn't natural and normal. In this case, the Omelas child is acting as a scapegoat, which is a glue, a social glue that holds these people together. Societies need methods of inclusion and exclusion. To be part of a social group, to feel part of a social group, you have to have some inclusion, exclusion, this sort of sorting methodology. So usually, for us to take on a social identity, to feel part of a social group, we have to conduct a ritual, or otherwise, be made part of some sort of ritual. So as a simple example, if you want to feel part of your family, there's a way in which you're born into your family, but to kind of feel connected to your family, you have to continually perform particular rituals. You call your mother, every Sunday or whatever it is you do. The calling of your mother every Sunday to a certain degree solidifies your relationship to your mother. Um, you know, Families have all sorts of rituals that they do. Things they do. You just do it because you're a family. Anything that has that structural logic, you do it because you're part of X. Anything that has that kind of structural logic, where it's circular in that sort of way, is what we call in philosophy a tautological. Usually there's a ritual involved there. So a sports ritual is another way. You're a fan of the Blue Jays because you wear the Blue Jays hat, and that makes you a fan of the Blue Jays. Something what a true fan does versus there's a true fan versus someone who's not a true fan. What does a Jets fan do versus a non-Jets fan? You see this in all sorts of social groupings. There's people have ideas about like what a real Star Wars fan is, and what's who's a faker, right? Any sort of social group will kind of start to, as a group, they'll just start negotiating or making these weird rituals. The people will. This happens in fandoms. It happens with sports fandoms and also pop culture fandoms. It happens in family and love relationships, right? It happens sometimes also just with these personal. Well, it can't be personal if it's social, but people do particular things. Religious rituals, the most obvious. But sports rituals and familial rituals and so on kind of get included here. One way that societies cohere is through rituals. Another way, though, is through enemies. A society has the same enemies. You're a part of some group, and therefore you hate another group, right? Or you have sometimes the enemies will be somewhat spectral in a certain sense. These will go through cycles. There's a time in America, in the US, when communists were the great enemy. And so you had these sorts of in-out groups. Americans would define themselves into these groups, by in kind of a negative identity in relation. I'm not X, and therefore I'm American. And there's all sorts of qualities that get attributed to the other group, to communists or terrorists or whatever group it is that America is defining itself against at the current time. And then these qualities that therefore get attributed to quote unquote Americans. You see a weird phenomenon in the States right now, or at least in the last few years, you've been seeing versions of it where Americans themselves are dividing along particular lines. They're starting to see internal enemies, internally dividing themselves in these sorts of groups. People do or do not represent the people. And you've got a kind of a populist phase in America happening these days. But regardless, there's these scapegoats. Scapegoats, enemies, rituals. The way scapegoats work is a little different from enemies, because a scapegoat is not the same as an enemy precisely, but it's very similar. One way that the scapegoat works like an enemy is the idea that if we could just get rid of these things, then, again, this is a fantasy structure. If we just got rid of X, we would have a perfect society. Now, Omelas is not the same. This is usually how the form of how racism takes hold in a country. The idea that some group will get scapegoated, and people will believe, groups will believe that some other group, if they could be gotten rid of, would, result in some new prosperity. or some return to an old prosperity, usually an illusory one. And you see different forms of that. You see both sides are doing it in the U.S. right now. Again, just a simple example, you have your kind of Republicans and your Democrats, right? And the Republicans, believe that if you could only just get rid of these Democrats, everything would be growing great, and vice versa, right? There's this sort of belief system in play. It doesn't tend to divide itself super cleanly along party lines like that, but you do have that idea. I know people who just have been waiting for the day that Trump leaves office, because of course Trump to them is Satan. He's the reason why everything is going wrong. If they just get rid of him, everything would be going great, and so on and so forth. And then when Trump was, on the campaign trail, he was saying the same sorts of things about Hillary that, people were saying about him. She's the problem. If you just got rid of her, there's this corruption. If we could just get rooted out and get rid of it, we could drain the swamp and we would be back to, some great state. Of course, in all cases, we're working on a fantasy. Nothing's going to change when you get rid of Trump. Nothing's going to change if you get rid of Hillary. You just move. All the problems are structural problems, and individuals don't really matter that much in terms of a system. It's the system itself that has to be addressed or altered in some particular way. But if you can scapegoat a particular individual, or if you can scapegoat, the child, well, Omelas doesn't have to change, right? All the things that are wrong in Omelas can be ignored. They can enjoy and be happy. They don't have to address anything, because all they have to do is figure out some fix for this one problem. They only have one problem in Omelas, right? Is their belief. And how bad a place can it be if there's only one problem? In reality, of course, it's probably a much more complicated scenario. Regardless of how the scenario plays out here, we have this idea that the people of Omelas are complicit in the child's suffering, but perhaps don't see it. They get the idea that somebody is, tormenting, torturing this child, but it's not them. They understand it is happening. They have been told it is happening for their benefit. They don't believe there's anything they can do about it. So they just, go on with their lives. When it bothers them, they ignore it. They maybe work hard to ignore it. Perhaps they're so happy because they're working so hard to ignore it. But there's some people who walk away. Now, what you think of those people who walk away, I think, is a very complicated question, and it is fundamentally one that I don't think the story gives a great answer to. Not that it needs to. There's a lot of interesting ambiguity in this particular story. Like, are you meant to admire the people who walk away from Omelas? Again, are we supposed to see them as people who live life as a principle? Or are we to see them as something cowardly? Is it cowardly to walk away from Omelas? Is there a difference between the people who walk away from Omelas and the people who stay there? Like, is there a difference between benefiting, from the abusive situation and just ignoring it in a different way, like refusing to participate? Perhaps that's the only autonomy they have. Maybe they don't really have the ability to change anything, but they could at least, opt out. Opt out of the society. Don't enjoy its benefits, even though they're not able to solve its problems. Is it again an admirable thing to opt out on principle in that way, or is it just a matter of abdicating responsibility in the same sort of way that the people who stay in Omelas abdicated responsibility? Neither of them, whether they walk away or stay, are changing the situation of the child. Although, again, we have the potential or the suggestion that perhaps that if enough people walk away, if enough people opt out, perhaps, things start to fall apart and the society changes. A story like this is giving us a lot of questions. It's not necessarily providing answers to us. I think that is something that makes the story interesting and gives us a lot to look at in terms of the interpretation. On a simple technical track, I'll point out that it is a story that is mixing a complicated narration here. There are moments, for example, when it makes the narrator has made it clear that they don't know certain things about Omelas. So, for example, and they argue perhaps that it is a thing they have almost made up. They say, quote, Omelas sounds, in my words, like a city in a fairy tale long ago and far away once upon a time. And perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bits, assuming it will rise to the occasion. For certainly I cannot suit you all. And she, the character goes on to talk about all the different aspects of Omelas and imagine them. It is an interesting story as well in the sense that they aren't sure of certain things. The narrator notes that they're not certain whether X or Y has happened. They're not certain of everything in Omelas. They don't quite have this omniscient total ability to understand everything that's happening here in this city, or they have lines, for example, like, Omelas could perfectly well have central heating, subway trains, washing machines, all kinds of marvelous devices not yet invented here, floating light sources, fuelless power, a cure for the common cold, or they could have none of that. It doesn't matter. It's an as you like it. It's an interesting sort of moment there in the story because one, there's a few things happening in just those few lines. One, it establishes the narrator as being here in a different place that is not Omelas, with us. Wherever we are in the story, that's where the narrator is also positioned. They're not at Omelas. They're not there telling us about what's happening there. Also, they, seem to be admitting to not really having a lot of the information about Omelas that we maybe have been assuming that they have, or that they even seem to have. They say, it might have all these things, but it might have none of those things. Because, of course, they don't seem to know. But they don't seem to know because it doesn't even matter. They point out that it doesn't even matter. And therefore, as you like it. So there's a suggestion that we can just imagine Omelas the way we want to imagine it. These things don't matter. The things that matter are the things we're going to be told about later. The gist of it matters, and certain specific things like the horror at the heart of Omelas is something that matters. So there's a number of different things going on here. We have a narrator who, on one hand, seems to be telling us a story. On the other hand, seems to be inviting us to craft the story. They're telling us things about Omelas, but they're also letting us invent things about Omelas, things that don't matter as much, and therefore can be left up to our own interpretations. There's a level at which this Omelas story, then, we have this narrator who's sort of telling us about a fantasy land, but also almost acknowledging the fantasy construction of that land, as opposed to the normal technique in a lot of fantasy stories. We'll see the reverse technique, of course, in horror stories, trying to convince us of the reality of the fantasy scenario. Here we don't have any of that. We're very grounded in the unreality. We're almost having the unreality of the place insisted upon, not until we get to the horror elements, so the nightmare aspect of Omelas, do we get the sense that there is anything that we have to believe that is essential to Omelas. This is the one thing that, of course, we can't imagine that we're being told is the case. We have to accept it, even as we're maybe struggling to understand precisely how this kind of a thing could be.